So after we vacuum formed our parts, we're gonna have this relatively large piece that we need to trim the parts out from. I have two patterns that I had put on here, so I'm able to make two parts at the same time. But you can see there's quite a bit of extra material and waste. We're doing that so there's enough clearance so the part really works. In production, they really tune this up so the parts are much closer together, they're tighter, and they quite often will gang up many of these all at the same time. But for our situation, we're trying to get a nice clean part and we need enough clearance on there. So we got to trim these out. So the best way to do that is to use, I use a utility knife. Now this material is very flexible, it's very durable, and it's very strong. Once you start cutting into it, and you put enough pressure to cut, it sometimes can slip and start passing very quickly through the material. So it needs to be very, very careful. I will probably help everybody do this because we're gonna probably make several parts for the different students all in one piece, and then we'll trim them out. So there's two trimming operations here. One is just to get the bulk part out, and then there's the fine tuning trimming that we're gonna do later. So I had started this. So this is pretty straightforward. There's no real level of accuracy. We just want to get our part out of this larger piece so I can trim it very clean. So you can see I'm applying quite a bit of pressure, but I want to keep my hands away from the path of that knife. Okay. Oops. There we go. Okay, so this is just removing that from the excess material. So this is a clear PETG, and it has a protective film on it on both sides because it does scratch pretty easily. What's nice is we're able to vacuum form it with that protective material on, which is great. So it keeps it nice and clean until we get right up to the end. So when we remove that, this will be a lot clearer and a little less milky. So this is from the last vac form that I did for the tutorial. And this one, I had heated up the material just a little bit too much, and I got a little bit of this webbing. The webbing is where the material kind of bunches together. So it's not as great a part. It's okay, it'll still function. Because I have several others that I had made. So that's removing it from that excess material. So here, it's the same situation I had here, and I have the film still on. So this is a really rough cut. So that was the plan. All of that is extra material. I only need the material up to this little edge here, which is called the flange. So I kept that flange on a nice flat surface so it's easy to cut. So to organize that, what I did was I went back to my pattern and I measured. I'm doing a 1/4 inch flange, which is a good rule of thumb. Sometimes it can be a little less, maybe 200,000. Sometimes they go up as far as 3/8 for a very large part. So I'm gonna do about a 1/4 inch. So what I did is right on my pattern, I measured a 1/4 inch away from the edge of my part all the way around. I just connected the lines. I just ran it with a pen and drew it all around here. So now I have this nice black edge here on the pattern. And I'm going to use that as a trim guide. Now this is easy because the part's clear and I can see through the part to cut that. Some people might make parts that are opaque, which would mean that have styrene and you can't see through it. So what we'll probably have to do is do this measurement right on the part. We will measure from the edge, draw a line, and then cut on that line and clean that up as best we can. So it's a little bit of a different process for opaque materials. So I started doing this one. I just took the part, put it right back on here, and we can see right through to the line and cut that. I'm gonna do this with an X-Acto knife. So I had started cutting this, and I'm trying to leave this nice flange on the edge here. And that has some functionality to making the part very strong. So again, we have to be, I'm gonna do a little bit of a finer cut, so I'm gonna use an X-Acto knife for this. Same principle though, gotta keep our hands away from the material. Once you start cutting, I'm just gonna follow this line by hand. Once you start cutting, I'm pressing pretty hard. I'm just gonna take my time and go very slowly. Don't rush this. Because if I start pushing harder and I slip, this is gonna go flying right off of the part. I'm gonna keep my hand far enough away. This will probably take a couple of passes. Once I do one pass, I can probably press a little bit harder, go a little quicker. But sometimes it'll slip and go flying off because it's very easily can maneuver right outside of that path. So I can feel I'm cutting right down to the pattern. I don't want to cut too far into the pattern because I would like to use this again to make some more parts. I can hear the difference and I can feel it cutting in, and I can check. So we can pull this part off. And I'm just about to, oh, a little bit more. Okay, we should do it. I think I did most of these. So I'll just do a couple of these. So again, this is the first path. I'm going to take my time. Don't want to slip. I want to keep the part nice and clean and don't want to hurt myself. Okay, and we have this little straight edge right here. Okay, that looks pretty clean. Let's see how we did. All right, so here I'm going to do a little bit by hand, but again, I'm going to be very, very careful. Keep my hands out of the way. Just sort of get those little corners. Ultimately, there are radiuses in those corners, but I'm not going to try to do that at this point. I'm going to even do that with a little sandpaper and very clean. Take one step at a time because those are very hard to do and the potential for slipping is very high. So I have this little trough in here, and that's what's creating my hinge. It's a little hard to see this detail, but there's this in-mold rib right in here where the material goes down in, and that allows this to hinge up. This is a tri-fold back form. So we've got the 2 folds, but 3 sections, all out of one part. And this is going to help to trap that. So this is a little bit more complicated than your basic blister, but I think it's a good example to show how all this process is working. All right, so this is nice and clean. I still have the film on it, it's still protected. And then, like I mentioned, these edges are a little imperfection in the corner here, but these I'm going to sand down and clean that up. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So that's cleaning out that part. Like I had mentioned, this little protrusion of material at the end here is called the flange. It does give us structural integrity on this wall. If I had trimmed off that flange and it wasn't there, this wall would be a lot weaker, even here on the bottom. So sometimes we really want that flange, and it really helps for production. So once this is vacuum formed, what they do, quite often they'll turn it over this way, and they use a routing machine that comes around, a CNC routing machine that comes in and trims all these parts out very quickly. That tool needs room, whether they're trimming it from the top or the bottom. So that flange has a benefit. It's a little crooked here. That flange has a benefit for the production and it's required. I have done parts where they actually trim off the flange. So the routing table would actually trim that entire flange off. And quite often that's used when that part fits into another part and I don't need or want the flange, it gets in the way. And I have examples of that I'll show in the class. So this one, we want to keep the flange. So when this comes up, it locks together. So with a trifold like this, quite often what they use is they'll mold in a little protrusion on one side, and then they'll have a negative area on the other side, and they call them buttons, and they come in, they snap together, and they hold that. I personally really dislike those because when you cut a hole in the flange, you're going to punch a hole right through your PDP graphics, and it can be extremely unsightly. But that is how it's done, and I most often will have to make that compromise. It's like, where do you put the buttons? And usually right up on top, right in the middle of everything. I did this without the buttons, and I'm just going to use a piece of tape to hold this together. It could be done that way in production if we use a nice strong piece of tape to hold that, and maybe even make it a color and do some kind of a graphic on it. And, you know, maybe it's inspected by or something, and use that as a release. Then it gets out of the way and it keeps this really nice and clean. Most of the time, these vacuum forms, as they're developed, there's a lot of like in-mold details to keep them from nesting too tight for production and a whole series of fulfillment requirements. And these vacuum forms can get kind of complicated looking. I'm trying to keep this really, really clean to show it at its best. So this is the part. I still have the film on it. When you peel the film off, I don't know if I can even grab this. It's really hard to get that. I have one where it's already peeled off. It's just a light film on here. Let's see if I can even get that started. There we go. Here it comes. When you peel that off, it's a nice shiny part inside. If you peel off both sides, it gets rid of that milky feeling. So it's going to be quite nice when it's done. So these vacuum forms, I made a mock-up label that's going to go inside. So I just made this out of 2 parts and glued them together. Most of the time what they like to do with these trifolds is make it out of 1 part. And they'll do double-side printing. So it might come, part might come down, go this way, go back up again, and then go down to create the other side. I just made this in 2 halves, so I have this down at the bottom. I curve the top just for aesthetic reasons. That's a lot why most of the time they'll make it straight so they can fold the material over and it's easier to get the cardboard into position. But I'm trying to go more for the aesthetic than the functionality with this trifold. So how this works is it holds a light bulb, and I'll have that set up, is these 2 parts go on the bottom hinge and then these 2 pieces come up and that label gets trapped inside and that creates our graphic. But I still have the film on here, so it's quite milky. So when that's all set up, it will look like this. So here I've peeled off the film. I have the product inside. This pattern was quite rough. I did a lot of sanding on this to get it as smooth as possible. It's not perfect, but I think for our exercise in class, this will be enough to see how the process works. I never make vacuum forms myself. I usually engineer and design the patterns and the cardboard inserts or boxes that work with that, and I create the 3D data files. And I send those 3D data files to a model maker. And they'll ask me, what do you want? Do you want a nice clean part? Is it just a sample part? And most of the time, I'll want a perfectly clean part. So they'll go, okay, so they'll print maybe a resin model, which is a better resolution, or if they use a 3D printed PLA part, they will sand it perfectly clean. And they have equipment to do that. It's quite hard to get inside these negative areas. So I did the best I can. So we'll see some of these imperfections in the part, but it's not bad. And for our class, we'll do the best we can to get that to work. The whole idea is to see how to make these parts, which is quite interesting. And we'll do that in the shop. And I have that demonstration in another tutorial. So this is how the part looks when it's finished. I don't have any of those buttons or any of those in-mold details. I just have a little piece of tape. So it's quite clean. And I just did the same graphic on both sides. But we have this nice shape, these nice curves. And I have a flange sticking out, so it's quite attractive and works really well. And these trifolds stand very securely. A traditional vacuum form, just a blister, or even a classic clamshell, where the flanges actually become part of the locking detail, you have to mold in protrusions and things to get that to sit. And again, those protrusions and those other details quite often distract from the aesthetic. So I'm trying to keep this very clean and all about the aesthetic of the part. Okay, so that's how we wind up trimming out our part after we vacuum formed it.